This last talk is going to be given to us by Professor Darren Evans on the subject of why care about conservation. But before he speaks to us, just a word about questions. During the talk, there is the opportunity for you to ask questions of the speaker using the question and answer box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. If you're on the YouTube channel, then please use the comments box, and those comments will be relayed to me. I will read the questions and then I will relay them back to Darren at the end of his talk. And so please ask your questions during the talk. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Darren Evans from the University of Newcastle. Darren is Professor of Ecology and Conservation at Newcastle University, and he's going to speak to us this afternoon on the subject of why care about conservation. So Darren, you're very welcome. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion for inviting me back, actually, for a second year to talk on a similar theme. And what a year it has been. And if I could just have two reflections really on the impact that the lockdown has had in terms of our understanding of the natural world. Well, firstly, there was a report published just a couple of weeks ago by the United Nations and the WHO, who were basically showing that the human exploitation of nature is driving some of the pandemics, such as coronavirus. So on the one hand, biodiversity loss has really shot up the political agenda, and rightly so. And it will be very interesting and challenging to see how governments respond to these sorts of increasing pandemics that we might expect going forward. But perhaps on a more lighter note, one of the things that I found here during lockdown as well is that many of my friends have really began to notice nature. It sounds a bit odd, but people who were walking to work, for example, some key health workers here in the UK, were sending me all sorts of video clips and song clips from birds, asking, what bird is this? And very often they were very common birds here in the UK. And it's just that they hadn't really noticed the bird song before because of all of the road noise and just the noise pollution that comes from living in built up areas. So we're sort of seeing, even at a local scale, people beginning to recognize and reconnect to nature in some fantastic ways. And I've had some of my friends from around the world sharing photos of them walking with their children along highways, essentially in big cities where there are no cars, and really just spotting the life all around them. And I think if nothing else, it's helped us to see at least what the potential could look like in the future of a world which really does begin to embrace and take wildlife more seriously. So those are just my two reflections since lockdown. And so to my talk, I've called it Why Care About Conservation Part 2, partly probably because I've just been quite unimaginative in what I was going to call my talk. I actually gave the same title talk last year. So I've called this one Part 2, but believe me, it is different from last year's talk for those of you who may be listening again. And if anybody is interested in that talk, it's still available on the Faraday Institute website, so you can go and click on that. I will be referring to parts of it in today's talk, so anybody interested please just take a look. So in terms of the structure of my talk, I'm going to start by reading some of the summaries from the recently published report by IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Now, this was a high-profile report published just a few months ago, actually, and it really sets the policy agenda for nature conservation going forward. And it's really important that we look at it because of it not only provides a snapshot of the state of the planet currently, but also some suggestions as to how we might go forward. But then really what I want to focus in on is my own academic discipline, which is ecology and conservation biology, but specifically focus on this notion that this subdiscipline of biology is actually regarded as a mission-orientated crisis discipline. And that has all sorts of implications for how we start thinking about the application of science to addressing some of the global issues that we're facing. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on the relationship between people and the natural world. And these so-called framings are really important in terms of helping us understand not only the rise of the nature conservation movement around the world, but also how intricately linked humans are and how it's important for us to see how we are embedded in these complex networks of interactions between all life on Earth. But in particular, I'm going to focus on some of the motivations and values of people who are really backing the conservation movement, because of that's actually where I think there's a lot of dialogue already between science and faith and policy making. And it's an area really where I think religion can have a significant contribution. And then I'm going to talk about how we might tell a better story. And within conservation biology, there is a movement at the moment called Conservation Optimism. And there's all sorts of interesting theory behind how we might start motivating people in terms of collective action and the sort of outcomes that we might want in reversing the decline of biodiversity. And then finally, I'm going to focus on a faith-based response, but really what I mean by that is within my own sphere of British Christians and in particular evangelical Christians, on how we might learn from movements around justice in the past and really begin to draw on that to motivate us to respond to the environmental crisis that we're facing. And hopefully, if there's time, we might start considering some of the ways that we could respond, both individually and collectively. So our starting point is this IPBES report, which again is such a significant contribution to the field. Many of you will be familiar with the IPCC report, which really dominates our thinking around how we might deal with climate change, for example. And IPBES is sort of the biodiversity and ecosystem service equivalent to that. And this report here is simply phenomenal in terms of helping us to understand the state of the planet and consider the ways in which we may need to change in order to live much more sustainably. And so if you go to the report, you'll see that there are some key messages which emerge. And actually, the key messages are broken down into subsections with much more detail. So I would certainly recommend that you go and look at that if you are interested. But in terms of the main summaries, the first from the report is that nature and its vital contributions to people, which together embody biodiversity and ecosystem functions, are deteriorating considerably worldwide. And I'll come and look at that next. Also, the direct and indirect drivers of change have accelerated, certainly during the last half century. And so our current goals, for example, those set in place through international treaties and so on, for conserving and sustainably using nature and achieving sustainability cannot be met based on our current trajectories. And so conservationists are going to be meeting together very soon and thinking again, or rethinking, how we might go about protecting biodiversity. And this report basically says that this can only be achieved through substantial transformative changes across a whole range of disciplines: economics, social sciences, political, technological, and so on. But also, nature can be conserved. So we have got the tools, we have got it within us to do conservation and to do it well. We have got the tools to restore degraded ecosystems, and we can begin to use them in sustainable ways, whilst also meeting some of the other societal goals, for example, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which again, I'll touch on later. So let's just go through some of those key messages from the IPBES report by looking at some of the figures within the report. And so this is probably one of the main ones, in that it looks at the indirect and the direct drivers on terrestrial, freshwater, and the marine biomes. And what it does is basically shows the extent of the contribution of land use change, climate change, pollution, invasive species, and so on within those ecosystems. And what we find is that the current state of the planet is that natural ecosystems have declined by 47% on average. Approximately 25% of species are already threatened with extinction based on the groups that we've studied. And of course, there's a huge amount of biodiversity around the world still to be discovered and recorded by scientists. The biological integrity of these interacting communities of organisms, the abundance of naturally present species has declined by 23%. And staggeringly, the global biomass of wild mammals has fallen by 82% since 1970. And there are also indications of how nature and the ongoing deterioration of nature is impacting upon local communities and indigenous peoples. Now, one of the interesting things, if you go to the left-hand side of the slide where we can see the indirect drivers of change, you'll see that one of the unifying values across all of those indirect drivers, or unifying themes rather, are human values and behaviors. So the point is, human behaviors and human values, many of which are derived from religious thinking, are crucially important in terms of how these drivers then go on to impact upon the natural world. And I think it's the area on values and behaviors that perhaps we really need to focus our attention on most, particularly in this forum, because I think that's fundamentally important. It's actually our beliefs and values which impact upon the way in which we treat the natural world around us. And we can also look at how extinction is increasing. So again, from the 1900s onwards, you can see in this figure how the cumulative percentage of species driven extinct is increasing for amphibians, mammals, birds. In other words, the sort of organisms that we have a good knowledge of scientific data on. So extinctions are accelerating. And this is the current status of global extinction of life around the world. And you've got to bear in mind that we don't have data on so many organisms around the world. But there are some that we do have comprehensive data on. For example, birds, mammals, sharks and rays, conifers, and so on. And so the World Conservation Unions are basically contributing data to help us at least see what the current status of biodiversity is around the world. And one of the things that you'll see here, of course, is that for different species groups, the level of extinction varies, but is nevertheless very high. So within our lifetimes, we might start seeing species going extinct at quite an alarming rate. And so cumulatively, the IPBES report has estimated that now 1 million species are threatened with extinction, just really emphasizing again the scale of the issue that we face. Now, many of you who may be interested in international development will be aware of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so there's a whole range of goals put in place that governments collectively contribute towards. For example, reducing poverty, zero hunger, quality education, and so on. And what IPBES did was to use some of the selected Sustainable Development Goals to see how the decline of nature and biodiversity would affect those goals. So we can look up here, for example, at the no poverty, Sustainable Development Goal number 1. And they've got some tasks here to ensure that all people have equal rights to economic resources, build resilience for the poor. But the status that we find in the decline of nature is negatively impacting on our ability to meet those sustainable development goals. And so this is just a snapshot of the figure within the report. But the point to note here as well is that no targets were scored as good or positive in terms of their status and trends. So the point is, if we want to improve the livelihoods for people around the world, that is ultimately going to be intricately linked to how we manage the natural environment. And at the moment, many of our ecosystems are severely degraded, and we have an enormous task on our hands to try to turn that around, for example, through restoration initiatives. So there I've kind of given you the summary of the state of the planet. And if we're honest, it's just grim reading. It's really difficult for us to take in. And the whole notion that 1 million species are threatened with extinction is also very sobering. But we have some significant challenges before us. For example, we know that we need to feed an additional 2 billion people by 2050, using less resources from environments which are already degraded, and with all of the uncertainties associated with climate change as well. So the tasks are huge, but they can also feel very off-putting to many people who may feel that their own individual contributions are just going to be so insignificant compared to the task at hand. And this is where I want to focus in on conservation biology in particular, because if I think as a discipline, I'm really privileged to work in an environment where actually the science-faith dialogue is happening, and in some parts of the world is actually really quite active. And it's because people are united in their concern for a degraded planet and what that means for their communities and for the people who they care for the most. And conservation biology is still a relatively new subdiscipline of biology. And Michael Soule, who sadly died last month, was really instrumental in promoting conservation biology as a discipline. And he describes it as a mission-orientated crisis discipline. So in other words, how do we mobilize all of our scientific resources to try to deal with these challenges, which, let's face it, have been with us for decades? It's interesting, Michael was a Zen Buddhist. I was very open about that. He was also the first president of the Society for Conservation Biology, and just a real kind of advocate for getting stuck in and trying to do some applied science to help deal with the issues that we were facing. But one of the interesting things is, if we look into the history of nature conservation, we actually find that there is already a prevailing or dominant worldview, which is built on the Judeo-Christian understanding of stewardship. And the fascinating thing for me as a lecturer at the university is that this is just a given in any of our textbooks that our undergraduates are using. And so, you know, most conservation biologists will know actually that a Judeo-Christian environmental ethic is key. And it's not that it was just key in setting up the conservation movement, designation of national parks and so on. It's also currently influencing contemporary conservation values. And I'm really thankful to Hilary Marlow, who gave a talk this morning, who really kind of helped to explain that environmental ethic much better than I can with the time that I've got here. But one of the things that was interesting is that she noticed that the commonality along a lot of religions is that the intrinsic value of species is central. And this is sort of really important for our conservation efforts, that actually species have their own intrinsic value. And so it's inherent on us to care for them and to protect them and to provide healthy ecosystems in which they can flourish. And so, not surprisingly, intrinsic value is embedded in some of our major international treaties, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's one of the things that unites people. But what we've also got to bear in mind is that even within conservation biology, and I spoke about this last year, so do dip back into my previous talk if you're interested, that actually there's a lot of debate within conservation biology currently, and that's really centered around how we value nature. And so on one hand, we've got people starting to talk about how nature should be protected because of it has direct benefits to us as humans. And there are other camps that are saying, no, species have their own intrinsic value and therefore they demand to be protected in their own right. And it's actually this sort of argument around people's values, which leads us to what Peter Harris, one of the co-founders of Arosha, describes as the realization that conservation itself is inevitably a religious exercise. Now, before you start jumping on me here, Peter, in his wisdom, provided a caveat to that. And he says he uses religious with a small r, in the sense that this is an expression of convictions that are not exclusively empirically derived, at least. So in other words, there is something deeper within people which is motivating them into action. And it's in that area, I think, we have a really good chance for dialogue. So what do I mean by these changing values? Well, this was a paper published by Georgina Mace in Science back in 2014, who basically was making the point that our views of nature and nature conservation have changed with time. And so the point that she was making was that back in the 1960s, the framing of nature conservation generally around the world was about nature for itself. So our focus very much was on trying to protect wildernesses, identify areas where we could protect them, sometimes excluding people altogether. I won't be getting into any of the rights or wrongs of this at all. The point that I'm trying to make is that the framings of conservation have changed. So in the 1990s to the 1980s, and remembering these are generalities as well, and the focused on nature despite people. So a lot of our science was focused on extinction, threats to species, how we deal with habitat loss, pollution, and overexploitation. And then at the turn of the millennium, and probably coinciding with the publication of the United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, our focus then moved very much onto nature for people. And therefore, our focus was on, we need to protect nature, which is providing a direct benefit to humans. For example, pollinating insects are hugely important to us because we need them to pollinate our crops. So maybe we should target our conservation efforts on biodiversity, which is going to be beneficial to us. And then at the moment, from 2010 onwards, we've now got this idea of framing conservation as people and nature. And again, it's all about adaptability. It's about including social ecological systems within our understanding of ecosystems and so on. And if we take a step back, we haven't actually moved from any of these framings. The reality is there's a lot of overlap of these framings. And so in some parts of the world, you may still have a nature for itself framing. And in other parts of the world, you might have nature for people. But the point is, it's all to do with our values and our beliefs in terms of our human interactions with non-human biodiversity. And I think that's really very interesting. For the IPBES report, and this is my last focus on the IPBES report, what we've got is essentially an ecosystem service approach where we start talking about natural capital. And the whole rationale for this is very much based on that nature for people framing that Georgina Mace had in the previous slide. But the arguments for this approach is that people just assume, whether it's companies, governments, or whatever, that resources are infinite, and therefore people can just exploit them for their own purposes. And the whole idea of trying to provide a value or the natural capital means that that can then be embedded in some of the decision-making processes about the environment and about nature, which up until now have been ignored. And so, regardless of what our thoughts are on this, and again, there may be some time to discuss it later, the point is that even if we take that approach and embed it within the IPBES report, you can see from this slide that the global trends for most of nature's contribution to people are in long-term decline. And so we should be concerned. Whatever framing we use, things are looking grim. And I think it's really within this context that we find ourselves in a very interesting public square. So Hilary mentioned this morning again about a range of religious groups who are actively working in the area of conservation. And here are just a few on this slide. But what we've also got is a rise of Extinction Rebellion, for example. We've seen the rise of school strike for climate action. So we've got people, children from a whole range of different beliefs, but they're all united in their concern for the planet and for this relentless loss of biodiversity. And actually, what we're trying to do is to find a way to deal with this. And in many ways, this is why I think it's these sorts of religious responses, as Peter Harris would say, in that people have deeply held convictions that something is wrong, this isn't right, and I want to do something about it. And I'm going to do something quite significant about it too. And so it's in this arena that we find a whole range of ideas, questions, and understanding being shared. And I think that's a really, really positive thing for us. And so what does that mean for Christians? So again, Hilary gave a fantastic overview this morning, but this is actually a biblical basis for nature conservation, which I've pulled straight out from an undergraduate conservation biology textbook. And so it's understandable to many of my undergraduate students, for example, studying ecology, zoology, conservation, that there is a biblical basis for caring for conservation and that it does form an important ethic. And to summarize that, it's that non-human creatures are appropriate subjects of human care and protection. That's implicit, explicit within Genesis. And throughout the Old Testament, we see that legal protection is applied to the land as an entity in itself, not something for exploitation. But perhaps more significant, specifically to Christian belief as well, is that the non-human creation is included in God's stated plans for the redemption of the world to himself. And this idea of a plan and redemptive purposes is really what motivates a lot of Christians who work in this area. And actually, it provides a tremendous amount of hope to people in what can often be really quite depressing circumstances. But the problem that we keep returning to is that we see news stories. For example, the news story that covered the IPBES report, where it talks about something so big that I think it's just off-putting to many, many people. So here we've got the BBC News reporting that humans threaten 1 million species with extinction. Another report in The Guardian talking about plummeting insect numbers, which threaten the collapse of nature. And certainly in my experience of talking to people who aren't biologists, who I just meet with in my village, this is so sort of divorced from their everyday experiences, but also they just feel completely helpless in their response to that. And I think that's something we really need to be thinking quite carefully about. So we know that climate anxiety, for example, is a real thing. And certainly within my household, I have a 12-year-old daughter, and I've been instructed to moderate the sort of bad news stories that I bring home to our dinner table, because it really upsets my daughter, because it's really frightening. And so actually what we need is a better story. We need better stories, and we need stories of hope, which then motivate people. And so that really brings me on to my next point, that actually we can tell better stories about conservation. And there's lots of wonderful stories out there, and we really need to begin to exploit those a lot more. So here, I should have said at the beginning, I've kind of peppered my talk with all sorts of photos that I've taken from my travels around the world working on international conservation projects, which is just a delight. These are some photos from North Sulawesi in Indonesia, where we're doing some work with local communities on the restoration of mangroves. Mangroves are just fundamentally important in terms of protecting villages from tsunamis. They provide nurseries for fish, which are commercially important for the livelihoods of these people. And what I love about this is that here is one of our biologists in the field with I don't think you can see it, but a tiny fiddler crab on his hand, just really happy and excited. And we're sort of demonstrating this to a range of other people. And there's a lot of joy for people who work in nature conservation. They do it because they love it. It's fun, and it's just so awe-inspiring. And so what we've been doing is working with a range of people working and living in the communities dependent on these mangroves. And, you know, you'll see in the bottom right picture, we've got people from a Muslim background, Christian background, all kind of united in wanting to kind of better the environment in which they live. And so this brings me to a movement called Conservation Optimism. Again, this is just a snapshot of the website, and I would encourage you to take a look if you get the time. But if I just sort of read from the front of the web page, it says, as nature erodes and the response of human systems is inadequate or destructive, it can seem like the only rational response is despair. Yet if you zoom in from the big picture, a mosaic appears. In amongst the stories of loss, there are inspiring stories of regeneration and positive change, with nature making a difference in people's lives and people valuing and nurturing their natural environment. And this is the key. These stories are the key to securing our planet's future. We need to learn from them, replicate them, and thereby build a world in which nature and people can coexist. So again, use the Twitter hashtag if you get the chance to look at some inspiring stories from around the world. I've got one here, which I don't really have time to talk about, but I selected it because it's about what's called the giant wheater, which is this sort of rodent-size insect. Wheater in Maori means the god of ugly things, and I thought in a science faith context, finding the god of ugly things was probably going to be appropriate. But again, there are some really interesting and awe-inspiring stories of people who have brought species back from the brink of extinction, and we can learn from this and start applying it to a whole range of environmental concerns. And the conservation optimism philosophy is really based on the theory of change. And now this is something that's really kind of been driven by international development, I think, but is also taking hold of social sciences, particularly around conservation biology, by storm. And so basically what it is if we look at the rationale in the figure here, it's that species are declining, ecosystems are being lost, conservation can be effective, but there isn't enough of it, or conservation may be too narrow in its focus, or it's not inclusive, and this disempowers people and causes them to give up. And so through a range of targeted activities, for example, community building, fundraising, outreach, and so on, you can start working towards targeted outputs, which may be regional hubs of people, a global network online, and we're learning actually that we can do this very well during lockdown. Ways of having active dialogue between the public and conservationists. And then we can move to some specific outcomes where everyone feels empowered to act for nature. But importantly, that the stories are shared and lessons are learned so that those successes can be replicated elsewhere. And it's that sort of collective action which is targeted, which ultimately can lead to really what we want, which is improved trends for species and ecosystems worldwide. Again, the rationale behind that is much more detailed on the website if you wanted to have a look. But nevertheless, within my field at least, the theory of change is actually having a lot of academic interest. So very briefly, in terms of our response, so I'm going to be talking really about a Christian response in my own sort of sphere here within Great Britain. But what I've been most interested in is kind of looking at how Christians in the past have been involved in a whole range of issues and how they've really mobilized to help to reform the world for the good. And I've been reading work by Dave Bookless, who's the director of theology for A Rocha International, who's really sort of charted the rise of evangelical thinking, at least. And one of the things that he sort of says is that actually amongst contemporary evangelical Christians, that environmental ethics were of great importance to some of the early British evangelicals in the 17th to the 19th centuries. And we've sort of forgotten that. And he draws upon some of the parallels of people like Wilberforce, for example, who was so central to the abolition of slavery, to Shaftesbury and the Clapham sect's work in abolishing, in tackling injustice. And so one of the interesting things that he talks about in his work is the potential to kind of reinvigorate Christian thinking around environmental concerns by drawing upon some of these examples from the past. And what I would say is that perhaps the churches generally still need to find their voice in terms of how they deal with and respond to the ecological crisis. And there are a lot of Christians who have been working behind the scenes for decades to get us to a point where we now have declarations. For example, the Lausanne Movement's Cape Town Commitment provided a theological springboard around creation care. Hilary spoke this morning about Pope Francis's encyclical as well, which are all hugely important. But of course, what we need are for these sorts of approaches to kind of filter down to the everyday. And I've been rereading John Stott's last book that he wrote. John Stott was a clergyman and theologian. And in his book, The Radical Disciple, he really sort of draws out that there are 8 characteristics of Christian discipleship, which are often neglected, and yet he argues need to be taken seriously. And one of them is creation care. And so he says in the book, it's a noble calling to cooperate with God for the fulfillment of his purposes, to transform the created order for the pleasure and profit of all. In this way, our work is to be an expression of our worship, since our care of the creation will reflect our love for the Creator. But we've also got to be conscious of the fact that even within our own faith, we need to tell a better story, a better narrative about God's redemptive purposes. And so there have been charges against Christianity for the current ecological crisis, whether that's a misinterpretation of Genesis, as raised by Lynn White and others in the famous piece of work, again, which Hilary spoke about this morning. But more recently, the work by David Orr and others who basically criticize conservative evangelical thinking around the end times. And this whole notion that actually, why should we bother caring if it's all going to be burnt up at the end anyway? And there were some interesting Q&As around eschatology in Hilary's talk, and maybe there'll be time to do that again today. And so in terms of how we might respond practically, well, where do I start? The best place I would say to look for resources to really start thinking about these questions more deeply is to go to the A Rocha website, where you can find a whole range of resources available to you. But perhaps more specifically, consider potentially staying or volunteering at one of the A Rocha centres, where you get to actually live in community with like-minded people who are really passionate about the communities, the areas in which they work, and turning the biodiversity crisis around. And so, if I may, I'll just share this last slide, which shows Miranda Harris, who sadly died last year. And in this, I think she just sums up everything that I wanted to say in this talk. And if you look at the board she's holding up around conservation and hope, she's written, "We can look all the bad news in the eye, but keep writing our stories in the landscape and say with confidence, it isn't over yet. God still has plans for the world he loves." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darren, very much for a very stimulating talk. And as you've been speaking, lots and lots of questions have come flooding in, and it's now my joy to look at these and filter them and pose some of them to you. Let me start with a sort of double-barreled question, if I may. Clearly, one of the problems behind the issues being describing is us as people. And there's two aspects to that. One is our human nature, and as you mentioned, and as I think Hilary alluded to this morning, our inherent selfishness. But there's also the issue of our massive population, ever expanding population. I know these are two different issues, but maybe you would like to just comment on them both.
Yes, so as I said, we have got a significant challenge of feeding 2 billion extra people by 2050 based on the current projections. Population growth is clearly an issue, as it will have a growing impact on natural resources. But what I would say is that there is huge inequality in terms of the resources that are available to people around the world, and hence the ecological impact. So the truth is, the majority of people around the world have a relatively light footprint on the planet. And in fact, it's really people like us in the West who have the lion's share of the resources, and who perhaps need to consider better how we use those resources. It's one thing for us to kind of lay the blame, I think, on other people or on rapidly growing populations in other parts of the world. There's a relatively small proportion of us globally that are actually having the biggest impact on the planet in terms of our lifestyles. So I think that that is something that we really do need to take carefully, or to consider carefully, because of it means that the onus will be on us, i.e. the people who are causing or driving a lot of the degradation, to rethink our lifestyles.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Let me take you to a different area now. You've referred to this IPBES report on the intrinsic value of nature. Mm-hmm. And the question, well, there's several questions actually around this theme. Does that mean that nature's value is computed in terms of pounds or dollars, or is there something more fundamental behind that?
So the intrinsic value of biodiversity is very much not its economic value. It's the fact that these non-human creatures have a right to exist, essentially, that their existence isn't entirely dependent upon human decision-making. So that has underpinned a lot of conservation effort, particularly the CBD, in terms of the philosophy of why it's important for us to protect nature. It has its own inherent intrinsic value. the problem has been is that the conservation framings have changed. So many people would argue, well, our conservation efforts haven't worked because of, let's face it, most people running a company in Brazil don't necessarily care what happens to the environment in Indonesia, for example. And so what they've tried to do is try to bring nature into a natural resource management context, which may then be picked up by the people who are making the very decisions that are impacting upon the planet. And so the idea, for example, in the UK, we've gone through our own national ecosystem assessment where we know that pollinating insects are worth £500 million to the British economy, because of without them, they won't be pollinating a whole range of important crops. So the reason why putting a monetary value on it has been important is because of now the decision makers, the policy makers, the land managers, and so on can now see that there'll be a net loss to the economy if they can no longer have crops pollinated. But before that point, it was just assumed that crops would be pollinated because of nature wasn't included in that decision making. So that's some of the arguments as to why kind of we've moved towards that valuation of nature. And of course, the ecosystem service approach also doesn't just value nature based on its economic value. It also talks about the spiritual and the cultural value of biodiversity. But actually, in my experience, you see very little analysis of the latter. The way that's been interpreted, I think, in the West is very much about trying to put an economic value on biodiversity. The problem with that is that we've got a lot of biodiversity on the planet, which has no direct benefits to humans. And so therefore, you can see the problem if we target our conservation efforts purely onto biodiversity, which benefits humans, then we're going to lose a whole lot of other species. And I think for most religious thinking, you can't really reconcile that with scripture, for example, because of the innate value that biodiversity has, because it's created by God and for God, not for us.
Let's just take the economic argument a little bit further. I mean, some people would say that what we've fundamentally got is a conflict between economic development and conservation. Can you give us any examples of where these have been able to work in harmony rather than against each other? Or is that still something we're looking for?
I think we see it happening now all around us in terms of rewilding. So rewilding is really kind of top of the research agenda within conservation biology, because it's a way of trying to restore biodiversity from degraded ecosystems on the one hand, whilst also meeting our carbon emission targets. So to give you an example, here in Northumberland, in the north of England, where I live, it's an upland environment which is really kind of bare of the biodiversity that would have been here 500,000 years ago. So essentially, I'm living in an environment which still bears the scars of a Victorian farming system where we produced a lot of sheep to provide wool for the textile industries. And in fact, the shape of our fields, even now, still reflect that, even though the textile industry has gone. And so many of our upland areas now don't have any trees here in Northumberland at all. They have heather moorland, which in itself is internationally important and protected. But what the farmers are finding is that because there's no money to be made in upland farming at the moment, they're having to diversify. And so in order to do that, restoring ecosystems through rewilding is very much top of their agenda. And they're finding that it's also bringing some of their production costs down for livestock and actually producing top quality meat in the process. So although the quantity of meat that they're producing is declining, the quality of their meat is increasing. But at the same time, by rewilding their estate, they're seeing that not only a biodiversity that's been gone for decades returning, but that they're also able to meet a whole range of other obligations. For example, the UK's contribution to the Paris Agreement and reducing our emissions. So I see kind of economics versus the environment always kind of pitched on sort of two sides of the fence. But of course, they're both dependent and codependent on each other. And what we do need to do is start thinking a little bit more creatively and a little bit more smart in terms of how we provide livelihoods for people on the one hand, which are sustainable, where biodiversity can also flourish.
Okay, thank you. You hinted in your talk that you would welcome a question about eschatology. So here's a question about eschatology. And the questioner says, a lot of the way in which we think about God's creation depends upon one's view on end times. Many people say that because there's going to be a new creation, we shouldn't actively, although we shouldn't actively trash the planet, we should not divert most of our energy from telling people about God's creation to enjoy. The idea being that very much what you think about the future governs how you live in the present. And I think you were hinting that maybe some people haven't quite got it right.
I think we have to be honest that there are a divergent range of views, whether it's in Christianity, Islam, Judaism. I think in my personal experience, I don't think here in the UK, at least, we really talk about eschatology, perhaps as much as people do in other parts of the world, for example, the US. But what you do find is that often that sort of end times thinking does creep in to people's views around the environment. So I became a Christian at university at the age of 19. And I can remember sort of shortly after making that commitment, living in the halls of residence at the university, my neighbor, who identified himself as a Christian, came out and said to me, he knew that I was doing an environmental science degree. He said, I'm a Christian, but I believe that all things are going to be burnt up at the end. So why should I bother? Why should I bother? And although it may sound slightly absurd to us, and maybe, us who have this interest in science and religion, I think we shouldn't be too surprised that a lot of people do still hold those views. And I think it's really interesting how people can try to reconcile that with a more thorough understanding of scripture. But what I've actually learned, particularly in the Christian circles where I operate, is that a lot of people are biblically illiterate, if I'm honest. I think we just need to tell that better story. I think we need to kind of read the Bible stories and just be realistic with people in how we do that. Because otherwise, I mean, it's just illogical, I think, to just really to even hold that position if we do have a genuine biblical worldview of how we should care for the world. So what am I saying? I think eschatology does matter, actually. It shouldn't be the be all and end all, and people do have very kind of legitimate disagreements. But I think if we genuinely took the stance that we genuinely shouldn't care beyond ourselves of how we treat the planet or the people around us, then I think we've fundamentally misunderstood the whole purpose of Scripture.
Well, thank you, Darren. Sadly, we've run out of time now. I've got a raft of other questions that could have kept us going for another half an hour, I think. But thank you, and particularly thank you for ending on such a good note, because this is what we've been trying to do this week, is tell a better story. And we believe that as a Christian organisation, there is a better story to be told. And we've been helped with such a strength of Christian scientists from around the world. And of course, Darren is one of them. So Darren, thank you ever so much for your talk. We're really grateful for what you said and your contribution to us this afternoon.